Well, the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Readiness held a hearing last week on the Pentagon's program providing local law enforcement agencies with excess military equipment. South Carolina Congressman Joe Wilson chaired the hearing. It's about an hour.
Good morning. This hearing will come to order. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you here today and call this hearing of the House Armed Services Subcommittee of Readiness of the House Armed Services Committee on the continued oversight of the transfer of excess military equipment to civilian law enforcement agencies to order. I would like to begin by recognizing the dedicated service of our Readiness Subcommittee Clerk, Ms. Jody Brignola. This will be Jody's last official event for our subcommittee, and I want to personally thank her for her contributions to our efforts during the past year. I wish her the best of luck as she moves forward in future endeavors. Thank you, Jody. One of the objectives of this subcommittee is to bring attention to matters that impact the overall readiness of the Department of Defense. This includes programs or activities which face management challenges, present budget implications, or could be administered more efficiently. Whatever the root causes, it is our goal to provide necessary oversight in order to ensure our armed forces achieve the highest levels of readiness possible. Given the current threats facing our nation and the budgetary pressure placed on the Department of Defense, accountability is always paramount and every dollar counts. Vigorous oversight can help ensure that mistakes don't happen, and when they inevitably do, we learn lessons from missteps. For this reason, I am very grateful that we have convened this hearing today on the recent Government Accountability Office GAO report highlighting deficiencies found with the management and operation of the Law Enforcement Support Office, LESO, L-E-S-O, within the Defense Logistics Agency. The LESO is responsible for the 1033 program, which has provided tremendously valuable resources to our federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies since 1991. These necessary items have contributed to law enforcement's ability to conduct counter-narcotics, counter-terrorism, and border security missions throughout the United States and ensure that items already paid for by the taxpayer continue to protect and serve the citizens of the United States. Earlier this month, the GAO report stated that the DLA-managed LESO program inappropriately assigned more than 100 controlled items with an estimated value of $1.2 million. This revealed deficiencies in the process for verification and approval of federal law enforcement agency applications and in the transfer of controlled property. The Department of Defense DLA and LESO program must improve its monitoring, management, and administration of this critical and very important program. I read the GAO recommendations very carefully and applaud DLA for taking a very proactive approach to addressing the shortfalls and immediately acknowledging, amazingly enough, the problems identified. I look forward to hearing what progress the DLA has made in continuing to remedy these various deficiencies. Our oversight intends to ensure that taxpayer dollars are used responsibly, security is maintained for sensitive items, and accountability of equipment is never taken for granted. Our panel will address the findings and recommendations of the GAO report, as well as the actions taken by DLA to correct identified deficiencies. I now turn to our very valued ranking colleague, Congresswoman Madeline Badallo of Guam, for her introductory comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for calling this important hearing on the recent GAO report on the DoD Excess Property Program, also known as the 1033 program. And thank you also to our four witnesses for being with us today for what I expect to be an insightful discussion. Let me begin by stating that I understand the value of the 1033 program. It allows federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies to fill critical equipment shortfalls at little to no additional cost to the taxpayer, leveraging excess DoD property. Now, many of these items are non-controlled, can be purchased at any office supply or furniture store, and help alleviate budgetary stress, particularly on local agencies. However, this equipment can also be controlled property, items that are sensitive in nature and cannot be released to the general public, such as firearms and military-grade imagery technologies. And that is what makes the GAO report particularly concerning. Not only does it highlight the negligence with which DLA treated property procured with taxpayer dollars, but it demonstrates a dangerous vulnerability that could compromise the safety of the American people. So I am particularly appreciative that GAO conducted this operation and delivered this report because it brings to light these vulnerabilities and allows us to conduct critical oversight on the handling of equipment to ensure reforms are in place to better secure the transfer program. I am deeply disturbed, however, by the prospect that a malicious individual or organization could procure DoD property, especially controlled items. Understanding that this is likely a result of a combination of issues, including inadequate protocols and safeguards, insufficient training, and potential cultural errors, I expect to dig down on how this program needs to be reformed. So I do look forward to the discussion here this morning and hope that we can come away with clear objectives and steps forward to ensure this program has the proper safeguards and accountability in place. Mr. Chairman, I thank you again for holding this important meeting, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Badallo. We are pleased to recognize our witnesses today. I want to thank them for taking time to be with us. We have Ms. Zena Merritt, Director of Defense Capabilities and Management of the Government Accountability Office. Mr. Wayne McElrath, the Director of Forensic Audits and Investigative Services of the Government Accountability Office. Mr. Mike Scott, who is the Deputy Director of Logistics Operations of the Defense Logistics Agency, and Mr. Mike Cannon, the Director of the Defense Logistics Agency Disposition Services. We will begin with statements from each organization. We will begin very appropriately with the Government Accountability Office. Ms. Merritt.
Chairman Wilson, Ranking Member Badallo, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today with my colleague, Wayne McElrath. Our testimony today summarizes key findings from our July 2017 report on DoD excess control property and addresses 1, how federal, state, and local enforcement agencies reported using and benefiting from the transferred property, and 2, the extent to which the Defense Logistics Agency, or DLA, has taken actions to enhance processes, including internal controls, related to the transfers of such property. DoD has the authority to transfer excess personal property to federal, state, and local enforcement agencies. DLA Disposition Services administers the Law Enforcement Support Office, or LESO program, for DoD. During calendar years 2013 through 2015, DoD has reported transferring approximately $1.1 billion of excess control property to law enforcement agencies. Controlled property typically involves sensitive equipment and items that cannot be released to the public, such as detonation robots, small arms, and mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, or MRAPs. Law enforcement officials that we surveyed and interviewed cited a number of ways in which they had benefited from the program, with several reporting that the transfers of controlled property allowed them to save money. The reported uses included enhancing counter-drug and counterterrorism activities, search and rescue, natural disaster response, and police training. DLA has taken actions to enhance processes for the program in response to past recommendations made by GAO, as well as DoD and DLA offices of Inspector General. DLA has taken some steps to address previously identified weaknesses in its processes and procedures, mostly at the state and local levels. In our July report, we noted weaknesses at the federal participant level in 3 areas. 1, verifying and approving applications. 2, transferring property. And 3, the assessment of risk. Through creating a fictitious federal agency, we gained access to the program and attained over 100 controlled items with an estimated value of $1.2 million, including night vision goggles, simulated rifles, and simulated pipe bombs, which could be potentially lethal if modified with commercially available items. Images of these items are pictured on the graphic boards here in the hearing room today. Specific weaknesses highlighted in our report include DLA's internal controls for verifying and approving federal agency applications and enrollment in the program were not adequate. Specifically, LESO's reliance on electronic communications without verification does not allow it to properly vet applicants. Second, our testing identified deficiencies in the transfer of control property, such as DLA personnel not routinely requesting and verifying identification of individuals picking up property. Third, while DLA has taken some steps to address identified deficiencies in the program, DLA lacks a comprehensive framework for instituting fraud prevention and mitigation measures at all stages of the process. DLA officials acknowledge that they have not conducted a fraud risk assessment. Overall, we concluded in our report that DLA's internal controls did not provide reasonable assurance in preventing fraud. Therefore, we made 4 recommendations to DLA. 1, review and revise policy or procedures for verifying and approving applicants. 2, ensure disposition services officials verify that persons picking up items have valid credentials. 3, issue guidance that requires disposition services officials to verify the quantities and types of items being picked up beforehand. And lastly, conduct a fraud risk assessment to design and implement a strategy with specific internal control activities to mitigate assessed fraud. DOD concurred with all of our recommendations and highlighted actions to address each one. Chairman Wilson, Ranking Member Bordillo, and members of the subcommittee, that concludes my prepared statement. My colleague and I would be happy and pleased to respond to any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Merritt, and indeed your professionalism is very, very impressive. Mr. McElrath, would you like to make a presentation? Thank you very much. And we now proceed to the Defense Logistics Agency. Mr. Scott.
Chairman Wilson, Ranking Member Bordillo, distinguished committee members, thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss the Defense Logistics Agency's administration and execution of the 1033 program, also known as the Law Enforcement Support Office Program, or LESO program. I am Mike Scott, Deputy Director, DLA Logistics Operations. With me today is Mr. Mike Cannon, the Director of DLA Disposition Services. We appreciate the opportunity to discuss the July 2017 GAO report on Department of Defense excess property and to advise you of the actions we have taken to further strengthen our processes. DLA Disposition Services, a field activity of DLA, is responsible for the final disposition of excess property received from the military services. DLA Disposition Services also administers and executes the 1033 program through their LESO. About 7,500 federal and state law enforcement agencies across 50 states and U.S. territories actively participate in the program. 30 federal agency headquarters are currently enrolled. These are the higher headquarters to the 345 federal law enforcement activities participating in the program. DLA has worked extensively over the last several years to improve the state and local side of the program, which is 96% of total participation. While the GAO's recent review did validate enhancements made in the state and local program, it also highlighted vulnerabilities in the federal program. DLA takes the findings very seriously and is actively addressing and correcting the deficiencies. In September 2015, DLA began a focused improvement effort to strengthen our federal program. We've implemented robust controls in our federal program, which already exist in our state program. Specifically, we have revised our procedures for verifying and approving federal agency applications for enrollment. First, DLA now requires an executive-level representative in the federal agency designate a point of contact in writing. This POC will serve as the agency's federal coordinator who will validate and endorse all enrollment applications and all equipment requests for their field activities. Second, DLA now requires the POC to sign a memorandum of understanding outlining and accepting their responsibilities for management of their program. We have sent all 30 current federal agency headquarters this MOU, and 12 agencies have already signed and returned the MOU. Third, DLA will visit each federal agency headquarters and meet with their POC to confirm eligibility. As of today, DLA has visited 22 federal agency headquarters. Additionally, DLA has strengthened the internal approval process for enrolling federal agencies. First, we have designated a federal LEA liaison to manage the application process. Second, DLA will utilize the FBI's National Crime Information Center, or NCIC, database to verify the legitimacy of all organizations. Finally, the LESO program manager is now required to approve all federal applications as a second-level internal review. With regard to the GAO findings on process weakness for verification of customer identity and the type and quantity of property issued, we have taken the following actions. First, we immediately conducted remedial training at the sites GAO visited. Second, we mandated reinforcement training at all 103 of our disposition sites. We're 50% complete on this aggressive effort and are on track to finish 2 months ahead of schedule. Third, we added this topic as an emphasis item to our existing compliance program, which includes, among other things, no-notice spot inspections and a DLA headquarters management review. In response to the GAO recommendation to conduct a fraud risk assessment as outlined in GAO's fraud risk framework, DLA headquarters, specifically our DLA Inspector General Office and my Logistics Operations Directorate, will lead this effort with participation by DLA Disposition Services. DLA has made significant enhancements to improve its policies, procedures, and internal controls in the 1033 program. We remain committed to continuous process improvement to ensure we provide the best possible support to law enforcement agencies in their critical mission. Chairman Wilson, Ranking Member Bordallo, and members of the committee, we thank you for the opportunity to discuss this important issue here today and are prepared to answer any questions you have.
And Mr. Cannon?
Sir, Mr. Scott spoke on behalf of the agency.
Thank you. And I want to, it really is remarkable that an agency acknowledges that an error occurred and has taken positive response. So we appreciate your service. I'm really grateful today we have really talented members of the subcommittee here, people who are really dedicated to the American people, and so many are here that we're going to very strictly follow the 5-minute rule. And we've got somebody very talented, Drew Warren, who's going to keep the 5-minute rule, beginning with me. And so we'll proceed right away. Ms. Merritt or Mr. McElrath, how did you determine the specific vulnerabilities you assessed that led to the decision that the LESO control measures by using a fictitious agency, how did you determine that? Again, we appreciate you being proactive.
I will start the response. While we were actually conducting some of our field work in some of the states, we were reviewing the names of the applicants. And as we were reviewing the names of those particular applicants, we noticed one applicant that had a title that did not seem to be a legitimate agency. While doing that, we questioned DLA, and they acknowledged that that was an entity in which they had been investigating and continues to investigate. So that was one of the key triggers for this, as well as we had made a number of recommendations over the years to tighten controls. And so we wanted to ensure that some of these recommendations were properly implemented. My colleague probably will have a little bit to add to that response.
Based on the information that we received from our Defense Capabilities team, we actually formulated a plan to develop a false or fictitious law enforcement entity and created an online presence. After that, we submitted an application to DLA for approval. We went through their online enrollment process and then actually went on their online ordering system to actually acquire goods.
And that's amazing, but I appreciate, again, we all appreciate you being proactive. Additionally, how do you assess the Defense Logistics Agency's current administration of the 1033 program, and how does this compare to what you initially found during the beginning of your investigation last year in 2016?
As noted, we briefed DLA continuously on the progress of our work, including their Inspector General's office. In May, we had a formal meeting with them where we fully disclosed our findings to them. At that point in time, they told us about some respective actions that they had started relating to the application. For example, they had modified their application. As the review continued, they also had begun developing the memorandums of understanding at that time. So, in short, a number of actions were already commencing as we continued and got closer to the end, and they realized that we had, in fact, posed as a fictitious organization and obtained items. Then they also noted that there were additional actions that they were going to take in order to close those particular gaps in their processes.
Thank you. And for Mr. Scott, your service for security of the American families is very important with the 1033 program. What is the process for a law enforcement agency to obtain control items? What additional steps in the authorization process for obtaining the items has been considered in light of the Government Accountability Office investigation?
So, Chairman, as the GAO said, our process previous to finding out what they were able to accomplish required that Mr. Cannon's organization worked directly with the federal law agencies. There was an application that had to be filed. They had to provide statutes of authority. Special agents, senior agents in charge had to sign those applications to be able to get into the program. But as you've heard, that our controls were not adequate. We recognize that. We had started our efforts to improve the federal program prior to the GAO starting their effort. And I will say immediately, I think the first meetings we had with them were in March of 2017 when we learned of what they were able to do in their investigation. By April 3rd, we had implemented those additional things that you've heard about. And those include now that we get an executive level sponsorship from the federal agency. We have a POC identified going forward. We visit those organizations to validate. We are now going to use the FBI database to ensure that their organization is correctly loaded there and they're legitimate. Those are all things we've added, and we believe those processes will prevent this from happening in the future, Chairman.
And they're very responsible safeguards. I believe there were 3 recommendations. There's still one pending. Is that being acted upon?
Yes, it is. As Mr. Scott mentioned, they're scheduling with the OIG in my headquarters to do the fraud risk assessment.
Thank you very much. Congresswoman Badallo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cannon and Mr. Scott, the GAO recommendations included strengthening internal controls and reviewing identification and authorization protocols. Now, given what we know now, what is your level of confidence that such a violation will not happen again? And secondly, recognizing that only 4 to 7% of transfers are controlled, should DLA temporarily suspend the transfer program for controlled items until the problems are fixed? You state that changes have already been made, but then we wouldn't be here if there wasn't still a problem. So will it happen again, or should we suspend the program until changes have been made?
Ma'am, I'll take that. First of all, the control measures that we have in place, I am confident will preclude this from happening again. As Mr. Scott alluded to or mentioned, we now require very similar to the tight controls we had implemented in the state and local procedures, a federal executive appointment of their POC, a face-to-face visit to ensure that they're compliant, and then as a backup, a national the NCIC database check to verify they are a valid agency. With those controls in place, I am confident that this won't happen again.
All right. Second part of my question.
Yes, ma'am. In March, when we got an outbrief and discussed this with the GAO, I immediately suspended release of all property to federal agencies until we could put these controls in place. Those controls included a memorandum of understanding, which we had began developing over a year ago. That memorandum of understanding was finalized in DLA in December of 2016. And until the agencies complete the new requirements, I do not release any additional property.
So you don't think the program should be suspended? Is that in essence what you're saying? All right, Mr. Cannon, DOD responded to GAO recommendations number 2 by stating that, and I quote, DLA currently has policy requiring on-site officials to request and verify identification from all customers. What, if any, disciplinary actions have been taken against the individuals and the supervisors responsible for oversight and training who approved the fictitious application for enrollment in the Law Enforcement Support Office program, approved the request of property, or conducted the transfer of the property without following proper procedures? How is DLA determining who is responsible?
Ma'am, we are looking at our records to determine the property that was released and where it was released, so we could determine as best we can the individual or individuals responsible. Prior to that, as soon as we identified the locations that the property came from, we immediately conducted remedial training for every person at that site for the control measures we already had in place that were not followed. Since then, we have also added additional emphasis on our controls when we do our semi-annual self-inspection, when we do our biannual compliance reviews, when I do my no-notice site visits, and when the headquarters comes down to do their visits as well. Anytime an individual is found who is either behavior or performance is not up to standards, we take appropriate corrective actions depending on the circumstances.
What kind of disciplinary action would you take? Are you releasing the people, changing their positions, or what?
I have a range of actions I could take depending on the circumstances and the situation, and I have taken actions for infractions everywhere from a letter of counseling to dismissal. So the range is open depending on the situation, ma'am.
Okay, I have one quick question. Ms. Merritt, while the majority of your report focused on the application, approval, and transfer of assessed property, can you provide insight into what you observed with respect to accountability and tracking of controlled property, both at the disposition sites as well as once transferred to a federal, state, or local law enforcement agency? And I don't have much time left.
Sure. At the federal level, we did observe one case in which one federal organization in D.C. was not aware of how much property had been transferred to that agency or to its respective activities in the field. That was quickly remedied when they contacted LESO. They were able to obtain a list, and they temporarily halted any approvals at that time. At the local and state sites themselves, that actually went pretty well because they had a state coordinator. A lot of the processes were being double checked. And so unlike the federal level, there were more checks and balances at the state and local level.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Bedalia. We now proceed to Congressman Austin Scott of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My questions are predominantly for the DLA. You said that you recognized the problem prior to the GAO examination. Is that correct?
That is correct.
When did you first recognize the problem?
We first started our efforts to improve the federal program in September of 2015. We began by bringing in federal agencies for more training to ensure they knew how to properly work with the program, and that quickly led to the beginning of the development of the Memorandum of Understanding. And at the point when we heard in March of 2017 the investigative, what had happened. As you heard, we quickly moved to implement additional procedures.
But you said your efforts began in 15. When did you first recognize that you had a problem?
So we recognize that the control measures in place for the federal agencies were not as robust as those for the state and local agencies in late 2015 as we discussed the program with the federal agency participants.
Okay. So you first recognized the problem in 2015.
Late 2015.
You were taking corrective actions, but you did not expedite those actions until the GAO report.
Correct.
So most of the items that are on these boards are not lethal items. Would the controls have been different if they had been firearms or a lethal item?
We have additional application process in place for items such as weapons and for armored vehicles and aircraft. So there's a more thorough application process that they would have had to gone through for those items.
So the difference in the threshold, is it based on the lethality or the cost of the item? What leads to the additional measures?
When we did our risk analysis, internally we determined in conjunction with guidance from the White House Committee and the White House Review Permanent Working Group that extra controls were in place. We've always had extra controls in place for weapons and armored vehicles and aircraft. So it's based on the type of equipment and the potential use of that equipment.
Okay. And so it would be potentially somebody used something fake to obtain something from the government and then turn around and sell it on eBay or at a pawn shop or something along those lines. Do we have any idea what happened to the items or the value of the items?
The items from the GAO report, sir?
No, the ones that occurred prior to you recognizing that something happened for you to recognize that you had a problem. Did items go to, was there a misrepresentation? Was there theft of items effectively through misrepresentation?
As we looked at our control measures in place for the federal program, we noticed they were not as stringent as the control measures we had in place for the state and local program. So our efforts were to make the programs more similar in the levels of control, not that anything had gone out, but that to prevent things from going out, sir.
So, but you do not believe that anybody misrepresented something to obtain something for free or at a discount from the federal government and then turn around and sell it for a profit?
I have no knowledge of that happening.
Do we know where the items are?
We know where all the items from the GAO report are, yes, sir.
Okay. With that said, Mr. Chairman, that pretty much answers the questions that I had. I'm happy that we know where all of the items are and certainly appreciate the additional measures that are being put in place. It's an important program. I'll tell you, I know a lot of the discussions around the program revolve around some of the larger equipment. I happen to know a sheriff's deputy fairly well that stepped out of a Bearcat, and as he stepped out of it, buckshot hit the window, and had he been in a normal squad car, he wouldn't be with us today. So I hope that we will continue this program in making sure that we get our law enforcement officers the equipment they need to do their job.
Thank you very much, Congressman Scott, for your insight and your personal view, too, which I agree with. Thank you. And we're grateful now to proceed to Congressman Anthony Brown of Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate that you and the ranking member have convened this hearing and to look into this very important issue. My question really goes to a little bit of a broader look at the 1033 program. In response to protests in Ferguson following the killing of Michael Brown, President Obama issued an executive order that included the creation of a DOD and Justice Department working group to ensure oversight of this program. According to the Constitution Project, that group has not met since January of this year with the new or under the new administration. In fact, President Trump has indicated that he intends to rescind the previous administration's executive order that ensured vital training for equipment acquisition, and that is of concern to me. I'm also concerned that the transfer of armored vehicles and high-powered firearms, as well as many other controlled items, makes our police stations look more like forward operating bases. It would unsettle me to see mine-resistant, ambush-protected armored vehicles patrolling the streets of Prince George's and Anne Arundel County. I do get the importance of the program. It's all about proportionality. So my question is, does the agency take into account the actual or potential threat that a community faces prior to delivering these military-style equipment?
So, Congressman, we actively support that permanent working group. For DLA, our vice director of the agency is our lead on that group. As you may know, that group looked very closely at the categorization of items and which things would be prohibited, which things should be controlled. They completed another look at that in September of 16, going into this fiscal year. And we take that very seriously. When we get the applications, we apply the decisions that were made from that permanent working group on what is allowed for us to execute. We execute the program. But that group, when they made those determinations in those categories, they brought in a number of different folks to have those discussions that included experts on the use of those type of weapons. It included civil liberties leaders. It included law enforcement leaders, folks from all.
If I can just jump in, because I don't have too much time. Can the small city of Seat Pleasant in Prince George's County with, I don't know, 12,000 residents acquire the same type of equipment that the city of Baltimore can obtain? Or do you do some sort of, again, risk assessment, right, potential threat, training, capabilities of the local enforcement agency?
So all requirements have to first pass through a state coordinator. Then Mr. Cannon's group also reviews that. They review it also against the size of that force and the number of items that they are allowed to have. The training for the items is that goes back on the law enforcement community. DOD does not provide the kind of use of training for what is issued.
Do you require the training, though?
We require that they show and state that they've done that training. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Follow up. I just have a little bit of time left. What efforts, if any, I think you may have touched on this, is the DLA taking to work not only with local law enforcement, but also alongside community members? I heard you mention community members in your response through the 1033 transfer process.
Sir, one of the requirements that we've levied on the program for the state and local agencies is that before they receive property from us, before they enroll in the program, they must be approved by their governing body. So whether that's the state or county, but whoever oversees that body must approve not only their participation in the program, but their withdrawal of property.
So like the Seat Pleasant City Council?
Correct.
Okay.
If Seat Pleasant is in the program,
right.
They would have
by
to
way of example. One final follow-up. Are there any restrictions on transferring equipment under the 1033 program when the local law enforcement agency is under investigation by the DOJ for any violation of civil rights? And is that addressed in consent orders, the handful that are currently in place?
We coordinate with Department of Justice, and anytime they have concerns with the department, we restrict the transfer of property to that department until they tell us otherwise.
So it's not you evaluate whether it ought to be restricted, or if there's a violation, you restrict.
DOJ evaluates and then advises us to restrict.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
And thank you, Congressman Brown. And we now proceed to Congresswoman Vicki Hartzler of Missouri.
I appreciate both of the good work from the GAO as well as the DLA in addressing this real issue here. So please discuss the process for a law enforcement agency to obtain controlled items. What other steps in the authorization process for obtaining these items are being considered in light of the GAO's investigation?
The process that we have in place for our states and locals is a similar process we've already implemented for the federal government. But anytime somebody wants to withdraw a piece of controlled property, first that has to go through their state or federal coordinator to approve that they need it. We also have some apportionment rules. We do give preference to counter-drug, counter-terrorism, and border patrol responsibilities. But for things like MRAPs, we also look at a local ability for law enforcement agencies that provide mutual support. And if there is mutual support available from another close-by law enforcement agency, we won't apportion them, for example, an MRAP. So we won't give the county and the city both an MRAP if they're in the same location. For weapons, we authorize one per paid officer. And for vehicles, it's typically one vehicle, unarmored, or like a Humvee, for every 3 officers.
Okay, that's very good. Given the GAO created a fictitious law enforcement agency that was approved for the program, how does DLA plan to review and revalidate the law enforcement agencies that are currently enrolled in the program to ensure each enrollment is verified as being legitimate and an eligible law enforcement agency? And how long will this process take? And what impact will it have on approving new applications?
So for the federal side of the program, as we discussed earlier, all of those are suspended until they come forward and comply with our new procedures with the MOU, the POC, our visit to see them, and are confirming their identities in the FBI database. We think those requirements are both sound to ensure integrity to the program, and they're also reasonable for a federal agency to comply with. On the state side of the program, we also intend to be proactive and go back and retroactively look at every single one of those organizations against that FBI database as well, just to ensure that we don't have anything else there.
Great. And the GAO report mentions an annual training conference for state coordinators, and Representative Brown talked about the training, and that the state coordinators take this training within the state. If this training is provided, why are law enforcement agencies reporting the need for more training on LASO program policies? And why did you feel the need to develop an online training tool? Why does this training vary within the states?
So we do an annual conference. It's actually next month in Norfolk, Virginia, where we train and advise the state coordinators on the policy, and then the state coordinators are responsible to train the trainer to train their LEAs. Some states do that better than others. To augment that, we have developed some online training to assist the LEAs. We offer over-the-phone or Skype-based training if an LEA needs training on how to get into the program, how to work the program, how to account for property. We also have what we call job aids, which are basically checklists to help them do the step-by-step procedures. As we do our program compliance review, we go out every other year to every state to review their program and to inventory a large number of their property. We provide training as required, as requested, while we happen to be there visiting that LEA.
Will the online training qualify to replace the additional the training that the state may have? Is it an either or, is it just supplement?
It's to supplement, ma'am.
Okay.
The other thing, Congresswoman, we are also going to take, when we conduct the fraud risk assessment, we noted the number of LEAs that asked for more training. We're going to make that part of what we look at under that review as well, and go to the furthest extent of DOD's capability to provide additional training.
Very good. Thank you very much. Sounds like you're taking very proactive steps, and we appreciate you doing that. Yield back.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Hartzler. We now proceed to Congresswoman Carol Shea Porter of New Hampshire.
Thank you very much. I'm deeply concerned, like everybody is here, about this, but I'm also very puzzled because it seems to me, excuse me, that there's more red tape to open up a donut shop than there is to get this equipment, or that there was. And I'm puzzled as to how the rules and regulations could have been so loose that they were able to create this fictitious agency to receive this material. So can you please walk me back to the beginning of who drafted these regulations that allowed, because as I listen to you now, and you say, and I'm glad that you're doing that now you've identified a point of contact and you have all these steps there. But common sense says they should have been there at the beginning. And so I would like you to walk me back to the very beginning. Who drafted this? Obviously, with so many holes in it that it was possible for the GAO to do this, and who knows who else. And I also would like to see that the people who drafted this clearly are not competent enough to handle this work. And so I'm not comfortable with the answer of, well, you know, we're going to go back and we have several possibilities. This is a question of competence. This was a serious job, and they failed the people of this country. And so I would appreciate your comments on that.
The 1033 program management was transferred to Defense Logistics Agency's disposition services in very late 2008 and we completed the transfer in 2009. And we are following procedures from there. The procedures that we had in place requiring the LEAs to complete a thorough application, to have a regional special agent in charge required to sign the application and have the statute of authority was identified as being insufficient by the GAO, and we have since made improvements. As a note, the application wasn't immediately approved. There was some back and forth between GAO and my staff, and it took several months before the application was approved, but it was in fact approved and should not have been. We have tightened up those procedures since then.
And I'll add, Congresswoman, again, we view it just as seriously. The other things that have been reviewed here, and again, our view of those controls was that with Mr. Cannon's group working directly with those federal organizations and the things he went through, that we did have the controls in place. That clearly is not the case. But the program has also been reviewed by other external folks as well. There have been previous GAO reports. We've had an independent review of the program by the RAND Corporation. And it doesn't make it any better, but the external reviews also did not identify these deficiencies. Now that we know them, we are all over it to make sure it never happens again.
Well, I appreciate your honesty and your comment, but it still doesn't cover the basic problem here. Now, I read something about now they're going to have to show an ID. So can you tell me what was meant by that they didn't have to show an ID?
Ma'am, when someone comes to a disposition services site to pick up property, if they're not an employee of disposition services, everyone is required to present an ID and follow proper sign-in procedures. We have always had those measures in place. In this case, those measures were not adequately followed. So what I have done since then is I immediately at the 3 locations, because I don't know the specifics because the GAO report didn't identify them, but we were able to figure out the locations they went to. We immediately conducted remedial training on everybody there to ensure they were following the protocols that are already in place. And then we started, I actually brought my 6 field leaders to Battle Creek, Michigan, to my headquarters to talk to them about this face-to-face in the second week of July, and gave them 30 days to train every single individual, every single employee in disposition services on following the proper procedures for identification of personnel and kind, count, and condition of property. We have about 50% of our sites complete, and we will be complete next month, retraining everybody and emphasizing the need to follow the established procedures.
And I appreciate that, but again, these are not toys, and these were rules and regulations that were violated and could have wound up in a very serious outcome here. And so I think just speaking to them is not enough. They had a responsibility to follow this protocol, which was weak enough as it was. And so I'm still want to know what happens besides you guys shouldn't have done that.
So the moment Mr. Cannon is able to identify who those individuals are, our agency and his organization have a precedent and are prepared to take the appropriate administrative disciplinary action. And that can be anything from suspensions without pay to removal from the position.
Okay, thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Shea Porter. We appreciate your service, and we now proceed to Congressman Don McEachin of Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Many of my questions have been touched on, so I'm going to ask one that might be a little bit more nuanced, and that is this: when you all dispose of controlled property, such as the items that we've been talking about, Do you take, and let's assume that you're going to, local law enforcement's requested it, do you take into consideration what is going on in that area at the time? For instance, if there are tensions between the local citizens and the police department or anything like that, or do you just sort of dispose of the property in accordance with whatever guidelines you have in place?
If we have a request from a law enforcement agency, that request for property has to be first approved by their local governing body, so the state, city council. Then that has to go to a state coordinator who has to approve the request, and then when that request comes to us, we will issue property if the property is available. If property is not issued to the Department of Defense, who has first priority, and to our special programs, who have second priority, and it's controlled property, then that equipment is demilitarized and destroyed.
Let me follow up on that and ask the question maybe a slightly different way. Assuming that it has been approved by the governing body, been submitted to you by the state liaison, are there any circumstances in which you say, nope, you know, City of Richmond, you're just not going to get this property for whatever reasons?
We give priority of property to counter-drug, border protection, and counterterrorism. So if there's multiple requests, that will determine which LEA gets it. But we also, if the FBI tells us that they have concerns with an LEA and advises us, then we do not issue to that LEA.
The other thing, Congressman, is we also have allocation limits too, so that in terms of the quantity of those types of items that they can have, that we look at the size of that organization. That's another thing that can limit how much of these controlled items a unit can get.
Right. Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman McEachin. We now have a final question from Congresswoman Bardillo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Merrill, we've heard that DLA describe the actions that they have taken and that they believe they have taken appropriate actions to fix the problem. Now, my question to you is, how would you assess DLA's actions, both in response to your recommendations and other steps that they have taken?
We have assessed those actions as positive steps in the right direction. However, we can't emphasize enough that we believe that top leadership and senior level leadership at DLA is imperative in order for those recommendations to be implemented. At GAO, we continuously follow up on the implementation of those recommendations, and we will do so at this point in time. And oftentimes in our reporting on programs, we do include those status reports. Those statuses are also published on our public website as well. So you, as well as the public at large, have the opportunity to look at the progress that's being made by DLA on those recommendations.
So I take it that you are satisfied with what they are doing now, but you're going to be closely monitoring it in the future. Is that correct?
Yes, the steps that we have asked them as it relates to the 4 recommendations that we have are all steps that we had proposed and they agreed to. They also established timelines in their comments to us on the report. So that's also very important as to whether or not they meet those milestones, and hopefully those will be immediate milestones. And so with respect there, we do continue to follow, as I said, and if there are problems, we duly note that.
Good. Thank you, Ms. Merritt, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Bardillo. And as we conclude, the 1033 program is so important to help provide security for American families. Mr. Scott, could you tell the American people, that is, how many state, local, federal agencies that you work with? What is the value of the surplus equipment that you provide?
So again, we have 8,621 agencies in the program. We have the property on the books of those folks through the program is over 1.5 million pieces of equipment, valued at over $2.4 billion in original acquisition value. That is the good that we're providing to those law enforcement agencies. Well,
again, thank you for restating that. It's so important that the American people know this, and Again, the GAO, we appreciate the Government Accountability Office, your success and working with the DLA. Where at this time we shall adjourn, and we thank all of you for being here today.